Hello again. People have lived in Australia for around 60,000 years. During the course of that time, they didn't advance beyond using sticks and stones. There was no writing, no stone buildings, no wheels, no use of metal, and hardly any clothes. They lived in the same way as people in Europe did 50,000 years ago. If Europeans had not arrived, then the Australians would still be living like that, a Stone Age culture in the 21st century. There's no denying that white settlers behaved very badly towards the native Australians, and that this awful treatment continued into modern times, well into living memory. This is a matter of regret, and it is very right and proper that society there now accords to native inhabitants the same rights as everybody else. I doubt that anybody would disagree with that. But the idea that we should now pretend that the culture which was found in Australia when white people arrived was in any way the equal of European culture, or was at all complex and sophisticated, is quite absurd. In the description to this video, I give a link to a guide for teachers in Australia explaining what they should and should not say about the country and its history, taking into account the sensitivities of the native inhabitants. For example, we talk in Europe of the prehistoric past. Britain has a prehistoric past, which is to say a time before written records were kept. I'm currently writing a book called Prehistoric London, which is the story of the Thames Valley up to the Roman occupation in 43 AD. Prehistoric is a perfectly neutral term. In Australia, though, teachers must not use the word. The guide to which I give a link says, prehistory is a term used by some archaeologists and historians. It was developed originally to denote the time before European history was recorded in writing. That's not true, it wasn't just European history, it was history in the Middle East and China as well, of course, but we'll pass over that. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people find the term offensive, as it suggests that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australia did not have a history before European invasion, because it is not written and recorded. Use of this term denies the validity of Indigenous Australian history before what is commonly regarded as written history, and before European contact. It also denies a place for Aboriginal people in history. This is, of course, nonsense. Writing a book about prehistoric London does not deny the validity of the people living there or here at all. What should we say instead, do you think, when talking to an Aborigine, or indeed to anybody in polite society these days in Australia? It is more appropriate to say, since the beginning of the dreaming. Since the beginning of the dreaming reflects the belief of many Indigenous Australians that they have always been in Australia from the beginning of time and came from the land. This is, of course, absolute rubbish. There was a time before there were any people at all in Australia. Connected with this, we see it's less appropriate to say Aboriginal people have lived in Australia for 60,000 years. 60,000 years puts a limit on the occupation of Australia, and thus tends to lend support to migration theories and anthropological assumptions. Many Indigenous Australians see this sort of measurement and quantifying as inappropriate. In other words, when dealing with native Australians, one must not use factual language and discuss history and archaeology, but must instead pretend to believe their primitive legends, in case we upset them by mentioning facts about how long ago their ancestors arrived there. Heaven forbid that we should lend support to migration theories. Do these people really believe that the natives of Australia evolved there and didn't come from elsewhere? If so, then we should give them a history lesson. This then is why the so-called idea of the voice has been decisively rejected by Australia in a referendum. It would have meant that all aspects of Australian life would have been subject to change, so that nothing was said or done which might upset the native inhabitants of the country. This might typically have meant consulting on things such as school curriculums. Imagine if the ideas which I've just mentioned became an official part of the curriculum at Australian schools. It would mean that not only would the real history of Australia not be able to be taught, that's to say about the arrival of the ancestors of the Australians 60,000 years ago, but presumably human evolution would also have been a sensitive matter in case anything was said which contradicted the idea that Australians have been living in the country since it came into existence, which is completely mad. This is just one example of the dangers which lay in wait had the referendum vote been in favour of the voice.